Welcome to Building Your Myopia Management Practice, How the Experts Do It. I'm Dr. Gary Gerber. I'm the Chief Myopia Reduction Officer at Treehouse Eyes. When you see titles like this that include the word experts, I know when I see this, I often question, well, what makes that person an expert? So let me start off by saying that this is not a clinical talk on myopia management. It's the practice management side of myopia management. But even then, I wouldn't self-proclaim myself to be an expert. So what I want to discuss first, before I get into the nuts and bolts of the content, is how I prepared for this webinar. About 5 years ago, I had a concept of opening up my own practice that was dedicated solely to myopia management. I wanted to get a little part-time practice in northern New Jersey. Did a little bit of research. I thought I could just kind of sublet a space, see 1 or 2 kids a week, and make a couple extra bucks, do something really fun and meaningful for kids. I, at that time, contacted my now co-founding partner at Treehouse Eyes, who said to me, and I'll never forget this discussion, he said, Gary, myopia is not just a problem in northern New Jersey. And my partner had previously worked at Ciba Vision and Novartis, and he had worked with Brian Holden in Australia, so he was very plugged into the myopia epidemic, which I'll be discussing in a couple slides. So with that, we decided, okay, why just focus on New Jersey? Why not get to our mission at Treehouse Eyes, which is to eradicate myopia from the face of the earth? So it kind of went from a part-time office to let's eliminate myopia from the planet. Now let's talk about the experts, and it'll help frame up the content. Knowing that my real sweet spot in optometry was practice management, I was careful to make sure I got a lot of clinical experts involved to help us with the venture. So we have literally some of the greatest minds on the clinical side of myopia management who helped us with our proprietary protocol. And in doing so, we've treated hundreds of kids in a very short amount of time by focusing specifically on myopia management and not doing anything else. So my talk today is based on what we've learned, our Treehouse Eyes experience during that amount of time, and sharing with you what really makes it work from a practice management perspective. There's a lot of other presentations and webinars on the science side of the treatment side of it. I want to focus on the practice management side today. There's 2 things you have to remember that's going to really make this work in your practice. First is, like anything else, does myopia really matter to you? And when I say does it matter not to the exclusion of everything else in your practice, but to the extent that you're really willing to put a lot of resources and time and energy into realizing how big this could be. Because I will guarantee you, if you dabble in this, you'll never get it off the ground. It'll wither on the vine and it will disappear. And when you have the discussion with parents, is it something that you bring up at the close of your exam and you say, oh, by the way, you may want to think about this? Or is it a really important part of your office? Important to the extent, think about your optical services, your dispensary, your eyeglasses, your frame boutique, whatever you call it. That's not an afterthought in your practice. It's a very front of mind experience for you and for your patients. And if myopia matters, if you really want this to work in your practice, then it needs to have the same presence, the same forethought in your practice. Doing this as a little sideline is not going to do it justice to the kid. So if you make a promise to me that you won't dabble, then I want you to watch the rest of the webinar. If you're going to dabble, well, you can still watch it and get the credit, but what's really going to make this work is if you really go into this with your wholeheartedly, with yourself and with your staff. The reason is because these kids need your help. You've probably heard the terminology myopia epidemic, and it's expected that globally by 2020, there will be 2 billion people who are myopic. The Brian Holden Vision Institute thinks by 2050, half of the planet is going to be myopic. So only 30 years from now, half of the world is going to be myopic. Now in front of you, you see 4 kids. Let's talk about the United States. And the four kids, right, of the four kids you see in front of you, today, 25% of kids, 1 out of 4, is already myopic right now. The eyeglasses that the kid is wearing represents 700-year-old technology. I'm not here to bash eyeglasses. That kid needs glasses. Myopes need glasses. But the fact that we've been doing it the same way for 700 years, it's very important that we recognize that and we acknowledge that, because doing something the same way for 700 years can certainly cause a very ingrained habit in the way that we do things. And if we want to break that habit, we have to be conscious that we're doing it. And again, this is not intended to bash eyeglasses. When that -1 1/4 kid walks into your practice because of a school nurse referral that he can't see the blackboard, I hope you do the right thing and get that kid leaving with 20/20 vision, be it contact lenses or glasses. They need something to see. So minus lenses are not bad, they're necessary, but they have really backed us into a corner. The size and scope of the myopia epidemic was really summed up nicely by Dr. Ian Flitcroft at the BCLA meeting 2 BCLAs ago. They meet every 2 years. And Ian, if you don't know him, he's an Irish epidemiologist, ophthalmologist. He gave a talk and he spoke for about 2 hours with all kinds of charts and graphs and Excel sheets, and he closed with this quote, which really hit it home for me about why we need to take this seriously and how big the problem is. Now you may think, well, what about low myopia? What about physiological myopia? When I went to SUNY, they told us if the kid is less, if any patient, kid or not, is less than -6, you don't really have to worry about it. There's really no problems until the patients get above -6. So they said physiological myopia is normal myopia below -6. Flitcroft and others now have lots of data to show that there really is no safe level of myopia, and that terminology, physiological myopia, is really poor language, that we really need to jettison that from our vocabulary. One of the things to think about is myopic kids tend to get worse. So that kid who formerly may have had what we used to call physiological myopia, say at -1 1/4, who's 9 years old, it's highly unlikely that kid's going to stay -1 1/4. And the risk of serious diseases, retinal consequences, glaucoma, etc., obviously increase as people go into more higher levels of myopia. So that's why the concept of physiological myopia really needs to be thrown from our vocabulary. So with all this as a pretext, if myopia is such a big problem, if there's no safe level of myopia, if it's all bad, and we have treatments to slow it down, so we could use pharmaceuticals or optical treatments like custom hard lenses or custom soft lenses, multifocal lenses, atropine, and some other new pharmaceuticals that are on the way. We have treatments that slow it down. Myopia is bad. It's a big problem. That's the if. Here's the then that we're going to try and solve. Why doesn't every one of the parents of these myopic kids just beg you to treat their kids? So that's what we need to address. We have to figure out we have this huge problem and we can fix it. But why aren't parents coming in begging us to take care of it? There's 4 things we're going to talk about, the 4 biggest practice management challenges. We're going to start with a question, and the question is, why doesn't Starbucks serve sushi? And the reason is probably pretty obvious, because that's not what they do. They're not a sushi place. They certainly could, but they have made a conscious decision not to. They don't dabble in coffee. They do it for real, and using the analogy and the words that I gave you before when I said don't dabble, do it for real, here's a perfect example. And there's lots of other industries that do it for real and don't dabble. Starbucks really understands the business that they're in. So once you make that level of commitment, you can go on to really build a great myopia management practice. With that, there's a couple things you need to do under the subhead of commitment. The first is you really got to know your stuff. You got to know what you're doing. So take whatever courses you need to take. Get yourself educated. Saying that you use off-the-shelf Ortho-K design lenses, yeah, it's probably better than nothing, but there's so much more you can do for these kids. Stay up to date with all the research. It's coming out at warp speed. You do have to make a commitment to stay up to date. Go to meetings that focus specifically on myopia management. Get yourself educated, to speak to other practitioners, There's lots of online groups that you can join, lots of good discussion groups. Become a part of those. Get in with other practitioners who are doing this for real, but really get your myopia management chops where they need to be. If you're just dabbling and you know a little bit about it and that's how you're treating these kids, and you're not doing the right thing, you will come to realize that once you get this amount of knowledge, it takes a considerable amount of time to do this properly, to treat these kids well. Realize that 100% of your myopia management kids that you treat are kids. And because of that, it typically takes a little bit longer. But one of the things that really takes a lot of time is because the majority of parents have never heard what you're doing. You have to spend time talking to the parents. I would suggest, just to give you as a guideline and let you know what we do at Treehouse Eyes, our first appointment, our consultation appointment, is an hour and a half. We probably spend about 50 to 55 minutes of that on clinical things with the kids, and the rest of it is reserved to answer questions for parents. And these parents are going to come in, they're going to ask you a lot of questions, so be prepared to spend the requisite time, because it's important enough that you do want to spend the time. As with anything else, when it comes to commitment, your staff really needs to be dialed in to what you're doing. If they don't, I can assure you, I won't assure you that you're going to fail, but you certainly won't hit your full potential. So for example, after you spend all this time with a parent, the parent goes out to your front desk. A lot of times parents will ask your staff things they would never ask you. Things like, wow, the doctor told me I should do this. Never even heard about this. Like, is a doctor for real? They're just making this up? I mean, it's really expensive. I just wanted to get my kid glasses. Really? And right there, a couple of things come up. First of all, you're not curing myopia, so the staff should say, well, your kid's still going to need glasses. Maybe not the first thing they should say, but your kid's still going to need glasses, and absolutely this works. Well, how does it work? Your staff has to be able to speak to the parents with a very high degree of knowledge, because you want that internal credibility, so it just doesn't come from you, and they want to give social proof that what you're doing is really the right thing to do for their kid. If you have staff members who have kids that you can treat, even better. The next thing is, under the subhead of being committed, do it for real, don't dabble, is make sure you have the right equipment. You probably have most of it. In addition to standard equipment you would need to do most primary care services, you're going to need a great topographer. Generally speaking, standalone topographers are going to be required as opposed to the ones that might be attached to your autorefractor. And secondarily, you need a means to measure axial length. I would strongly suggest you do not use an A scan. It's certainly less expensive than an optical biometer, like for example a Pentacam AXL, but it's not nearly as accurate, and reproducibility is very important. With the better optical biometers, you can measure down to about 0.05 millimeters, which is about 0.15 diopters if you do the math. And you can actually make treatment decisions based on axial length measurements versus diopters. Think about it. When you're refracting a kid and you say which is better, 1 or 2, the best you can hope for with any patient is -1/4, plus or -1/4, that you're going to get it right. With a kid, it's probably going to be a lower likelihood of getting it correct. So you really want to get an objective measurement, which is repeatable axial length. The next thing is that be prepared that you have to plan for these things to, like, how is this going to affect the rest of your practice? And are you going to, for example, not have a optical that's as vibrant or selling as much because you're putting more time into this? So get a good budget in place. If you're going to buy new equipment, build that in, and this will ultimately help you drill down to what fees should you charge. We'll talk about not exact fee numbers, but fee concepts towards the end. But definitely do the requisite financial planning so you can go into this and you can do it right. And one of the things you want to plan for financially is your marketing, because a high percentage of patients will come into this and they will not know anything about it. And the more education and knowledge that you can impart on parents before they come in, the better off you're going to do. So make sure E and F are kind of related. Make sure you plan for this and you have the budgeting. You're willing to set aside staff time. There's an opportunity cost for that. The time you're going to spend with patients. If you're spending an hour and a half with a patient, That could be 3 times longer than a non myopia management patient, depending on your template. So make sure you kind of budget for all this stuff and you do it properly. The second challenge is awareness. And if I had to rank these, I would say the number one challenge you're going to have is awareness, but if you don't commit, it really doesn't matter if there was awareness or not. So let's talk about awareness in more detail. Here's a perfect scenario of what's going to happen. I'll just read it because